The book has valuable insights the left needs to hear about the blockages blocking the revival of state capacity. And I think that's because the left as a whole has become much more Jeffersonian, small is beautiful vision.
Matt Huber is a professor of geography at Syracuse University and the author of Climate Change as Class War. He's here to talk to us about his new article in Jacobin magazine called Abundance for the 99%, which I have to say before we start, I want to preface this by saying, as the abundance discourse kind of like got started, I was like sort of abundance curious. I've always been like had a soft spot for Ezra Klein, you know, like Father forgive me, but I've always had a soft spot for him. and you know, I read some of the articles and I was like, okay, you know, I mean, this is maybe not so bad. But then like the people around abundance, like a group started forming a capital G group started forming around abundance. And I was like, ooh, these seem like not good people. And some other people on like the left were very critical of it, and I was like, okay, maybe this isn't exactly what I thought it was. So your article has critiques of his kind of thesis, but he's much more sympathetic, and so I appreciate that. And so now I don't feel as crazy because I know you, and so the fact that you have a more sympathetic view of what the book is saying makes me feel better about my initial sympathies for what Klein was putting out there. And so, you know, maybe we're both wrong, but that's two rather than one. So I appreciate that. Matt Huber, welcome back to the Valley Labor Report. I appreciate you taking the time.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So can you, for the folks, and I was talking to, we're on the radio and some of the stations that we're on are conservative stations. And so I was on yesterday, the conservative morning show host in Chattanooga, on the station that we're on in Chattanooga, and he was like, all right, so what are you talking about on your show tomorrow? And I said, well, we're talking about, we got a VA employee and union member on, we got a Social Security employee and union member on to talk about that, and then we're also going to be talking to this guy about abundance, and maybe it's not so bad. And he was like, what is that? and like this guy, like he's a full-time radio host. He's not like me, like I have a job. Yeah. I've got a day. This is his full-time politics job, and I think he literally didn't know what is abundance.
I'm not surprised.
He said, I know who Ezra Klein is, but I was like, wow, that's like super shocking because this has been a sort of like mid-level consistent discourse for like 6 months almost on the left, but I guess it has not broken it's not broken containment into his circles. So that was interesting. So outline what is abundance and why are people talking about it?
Well, I think the fact he hasn't heard of it is evidence of the kind of sort of echo chamber media bubbles we all live in. And clearly Klein and Thompson, the book, they admit the book is pitched to liberals. It's pitched to basically the Democratic Party. And I think the conversations and debates that have come out of it are very much internal to these kind of circles of liberal Democrats and the left, right? Which is where, and particularly the socialist left, where we're trying to intervene. But in terms of the thesis, I think the book kind of starts off with a pretty important, I think, and provocative sort of concern or question, which is why is it that where Democrats rule or where they have power, like in coastal cities like San Francisco or New York, why is it that life is really hard in those places? And why can't, for instance, why is there a housing crisis in these kind of democratic cities of LA, San Francisco, Boston, New York? And so what's the problem here? And why, and then more generally, why is there just this overwhelming, not just among Democrats or Republicans or just the whole population, there's a huge sort of public distrust in government itself. And there's a big problem there because it's the Democrats and the liberals like Klein and Thompson who are supposed to be the champions of government and of the public sector delivering things for the people, right? And so, but what they show and what they try to call attention to is that if the public sector and the government can't build housing, can't build high-speed rail, can't build energy infrastructure to solve climate change, this sort of sense that the government is this sort of incompetent failure is there's a good reason for people having that sentiment, right? And so they kind of say, well, we want to build what they call, and sorry to keep saying build, they say we want to have a liberalism that builds, right? We want to have a liberalism that could actually deliver a huge amount of housing, a huge amount of clean energy, a huge amount of high-speed rail, and you know, like they're trying to critique what they call it the pathologies of the broad left, and in that sense, you know, they point out, like, why did Obama champion this high-speed rail in California that literally never got built? Biden did the same thing with rural broadband. You know, they were going to build all this rural broadband, and basically none of it happened. and so that's the real question. And I think I think a lot of the left are not as convinced by their explanation for why this is, but they do point to the fact that in particularly these kind of democratic cities, you have a lot of, for instance, like wealthy homeowner association groups that are like NIMBYs that are blocking the building of big sort of affordable, even public housing projects. And on the other hand, you have a whole sort of network, and here's where the capital G groups that you mentioned before comes in. You have a network of very kind of legalistic NGOs, particularly environmental NGOs, that are constantly suing the government to block projects from being completed, and sometimes for good environmental reasons, but the ultimate reality is that there's this huge sort of network of liberal and progressive NGOs and that are extremely legalistic and have armies of lawyers who are really sort of in the business of blocking a bunch of infrastructure development. Some of it, again, they might be blocking it for good reason. But again, if you want to think about, okay, how do we build abundance in their terms of housing and energy, you got to sort of confront these kinds of problems that are in the kind of liberal coalition itself, these NGOs, these wealthy NIMBY homeowner associations, and this kind of stuff. Now, I'm sure we want to talk about why the left is not satisfied by that explanation, but that's kind of, I would say, as best as I can, like sort of laying out their core thesis.
Yeah, and in your article, you kind of lay this debate onto a historical debate between a Hamiltonian impulse, you call it, and a Jeffersonian impulse. And the Jeffersonian impulse being more like what we see the antitrust crowd today, saying that, you know, we need to break up big companies, big corporations. Just the fact that they're big is kind of bad, and we need more smaller companies, local companies, and local control, decentralization. That's actually going to be better for everybody. And the Hamiltonian response is more like, big is kind of good. Big can be good. You objectively get economies of scale. You can create cheaper things, and you can often actually pay people more. I mean, even Walmart, is as terrible as it is in many ways. This is certainly not the only reason, but one of the reasons that local grocery stores go out of business when a Walmart comes to town is because Walmart actually pays more than the local grocery stores do. I worked at one of those local grocery stores here that had been in the community for a couple of generations, and people at the church that I went to, they still, until the store got new ownership, they had a loyalty to the family that owned this grocery store. But I worked there because I was kind of in the community. And I made $7.25 an hour, and literally across the street, like walking distance, people were at Walmart, and this was like 10 years ago, right? But people were at Walmart making $12 an hour. And so so maybe actually the problem is not big, but maybe the Hamiltonian would say the problem is a lack of accountability, and we need more democracy there. And we need these big things to be, used for the public good rather than broken up. And then we lose these economies of scale, right? And so in both of there's real value in both of those kind of impulses, I think. And so, but, you kind of identify yourself more with the Hamiltonian sort of tradition, and I think that's more where I would fall. But even some on the Hamiltonians, within what I would consider the Hamiltonian sort of thing, the Saikat Chakrabarty guy, he has even been critical of this and of Ezra Klein's sort of abundance. And so can you lay out the criticisms of Klein's abundance and Thompson's abundance from both the antitrust, the Jeffersonians, and the maybe New Deal Hamiltonians?
So the most vocal critics have been from the anti-monopoly and antitrust left, which I think is particularly, like I was just saying, particularly upset because of their focus on, in some cases like environmental NGOs or NIMBY groups. They think they're neglecting a focus on the real villains, which are big monopolistic corporations, right? Corporate power is the real cause of our lack of abundance. And in the end of the piece, we do argue that, ultimately the real problem is capitalism. Like, capitalism thrives on artificial scarcity. Markets don't function unless you have kind of the maintenance of scarcity for things like energy and housing, which allow classes to profit off the scarcity of those items. If they were abundant, then the price would collapse and no one can make a profit, right? So there is a problem there. But the Jeffersonian, as we draw from another book that just came out that's been reviewed alongside Abundance called Why Nothing Works, and by Mark Dunkelman, and he kind of lays out this historical analogy for us, where the Jeffersonian and the anti-monopoly kind of impulse is to only see the problems atop society with these kind of these big, powerful corporations who are corrupt and, the robber barons, and they're from atop kind of, rigging the economy and doing all this bad stuff. And that, again, like you said, the solution is to decentralize that power to smaller businesses, which, as you pointed out, are not always great for workers. But the idea is that, decentralization, more small scale enterprises and local control. The Hamiltonian counter to that is not just that big is good, but that the public sector should really develop public organizations and entities that can provide a counter to these big enterprises, right? So that's why the New Deal is a classic kind of example of the Hamiltonian impulse, where I know I'm talking to the Valley Labor Radio show. So, our piece talks a lot about the Tennessee Valley Authority as, again, the FDR wasn't
just a really quick anecdote on that. I'm doing I've been doing some work with the Department of Energy for a while. And I had a meeting in DC with some people in the department, high up, like a deputy secretary under Biden or something.
Wow.
And I said something about, I was just a participant in the meeting. It wasn't me and this guy. It was me in a room of 12 other people. Just don't get it twisted. And but I, he didn't want to meet with me. Okay, he wanted to meet with the program I'm a part of. But
not yet.
That's right. But one of the things was fun fact about you or something like that, and I was fun fact about me is that I think that the TVA should buy all of the private utility companies and run them for the public good. And somebody was this guy was a utility CEO, right? And so I was well, you know. And so he was like, I'll tell Lyash that he has a fan. But anyway, so yeah, TVA, we're fans.
Yeah, but I was going to say that, like, you know, we love FDR and all that, but he was not a socialist, and he actually he didn't want the TVA to take over all the private utilities. He actually thought with a big federally backed public power entity like the TVA, you could do this thing. It's sort of wonky, called the yardstick, where the TVA would be able to deliver all this cheap public power that would keep the private utilities more honest and make them so that they had to compete with this cheap public power, right? So it was a way to kind of discipline the big private utilities with a huge public power entity, right? And that sort of, I think, sums up the Hamiltonian impulse to kind of develop large centralized planning and public agencies, not just the TVA, but, you know, like things like the Works Progress Administration and all these New Deal agencies that kind of built infrastructure, right? And again, that is kind of, I think, although Klein and Thompson don't really articulate it as such, they kind of, I think, are claiming that kind of Hamiltonian impulse that actually the government has to be able to deliver large scale public goods to have credibility with the population. But it's true that even sort of there's sort of people like we cite Sandeep Vaheesan's review in Boston Review, where he is very critical of Klein and Thompson, and he sort of presents the New Deal as the real path to what he calls kind of public abundance. But I actually think, and we say so much in the review, that there's not as much distance between the New Deal vision of public abundance and what Klein and Thompson are calling for. I think Klein and Thompson, in some ways, it's kind of frustrating. They're a little cagey and kind of vague about to what degree the private sector should be involved in this delivery of abundance. But one thing they're very clear about throughout the book is that they're liberals, and they want to ultimately create situations where government or the public sector can be more effective. And they often use the language of state capacity, developing state capacity to actually be able to deliver abundance. And I think that's the New Deal is one of in our country's history, one of the prime examples of that actually happening. And to Klein and Thompson's ultimate goal, which is to try to like win back power for the Democratic Party against this hellscape of Trumpism that we're all in, you know, it's worth noting that in the period where the Democratic Party was associated with this sort of public sector-led abundance was also the period where they were most popular. You know, if you look at the 1936 election results, it was like a crazy landslide for FDR. And it basically created this liberal consensus that dominated U.S. politics for decades because they built up this huge majoritarian popular agenda rooted in government, like actually doing stuff for people and delivering things, particularly for poor working class people. And I think that's why I think this book is valuable, because in some ways, because it wants us to return to that kind of vision where if the government actually delivers things for people, then they might become more popular, and you might actually be able to build more power against this rising populist right.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate. That is like why I was initially sort of abundance curious. I was like, oh, this is interesting. You know, I like what he's saying. And you know, specifically like state capacity is a phrase that Klein uses. I don't know about it in the book. I haven't read the book. I've read some of the articles and I've listened to podcasts. He uses that word in conversations around abundance a lot. And so I'm like, I like that. I think that is really cool. But there are two, you know, there are a couple of things that have concerned me about that, about the kind of crowd and the abundance discourse. And one is the crowd that has emerged around this this stuff. You know, people like, I think you even link to it in the piece, Josh Barrow, super anti-union, like explicitly saying abundance is going to require confrontation with labor. And, you know, I think Matt Iglesias has said similar things, like specifically, and also the Klein and Thompson, to my knowledge, have not explicitly disavowed those sorts of things and those sorts of people that are forming around this idea of abundance. And, you know, it would have made me feel a lot better if Klein were to come out and say, that's really dumb what Barrow and Iglesias are saying. Actually, unions are necessary for abundance. Even though, you know, and you mention in the book that he says that you know, unions can't be the thing because look at the stuff that I'm pointing to in these other Western European countries, these things that I'm looking to as a model, there's a much higher union density rate. So unions cannot be actually the obstacle. And he does say that, to be fair to Klein, but he also, I haven't seen him directly address like the people that are coming out and saying, actually, no, you're wrong. Unions are the obstacle, and saying to them like, no, you know, this is my thing, and I'm saying that unions are not the obstacle and we need unions. And I haven't seen that. And so that concerns me. And also, you know, some of the thing about unleashing state capacity is about, you know, removing some regulatory restrictions on the state to act. But some of those regulatory restrictions might be good, and that maybe if we go ahead and make those investments that the regulatory restrictions require, maybe that makes the investments maybe a little bit longer standing. And you know, one of the things that that Klein went a little back and forth with Sam Cedar was about air quality in affordable housing in California. And Klein was like, you know, I mean, look, it would be great to have like perfect air quality, but you know, we need to kind of build houses to put homeless people in. And Cedar was like, oh, why can't we just have good air quality in the houses that we build? like we can we should just do that. And you know, that's very persuasive to me, that we should just have good air quality in houses that we build. And you know, that, like, that's a persuasive argument to me. And then it's also like persuasive against abundance that there are so many like basically right-wing people coming around this sort of thing. So how do you respond to maybe people like me who are like interested, but I'm like, I'm being put off a little bit by some of these things. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think a lot of this discourse is a hangover from the kind of Bernie wars, particularly 2016. If you remember, kind of in 2016, 2015 even, like there was a huge war between people like Ezra Klein and Iglesias and the kind of Vox neoliberals who were quite distant and hostile toward the Bernie agenda. And I think so I think that there's a real reservation when it comes to Ezra Klein from that point of view. You know, Ezra Klein used to joke that he's been called like a neoliberal shill, right? So I think there's a hangover there, but you're right that there has been a kind of coalition forming in the real world around this idea of abundance that does include a lot of what you just would call centrist Democratic Party forces. And again, some of which say just ridiculous, horrible anti-union nonsense, which again contradicts what the book actually says. And I agree with you that seems like Klein and Thompson are quite happy to just create this kind of big abundance tent and hope that it like leads to, again, this sort of resurrection of the Democratic Party as this powerful state capacity party. And, you know, I think, to be honest, like that seems to be pretty much in line with what Ezra Klein and the Vox people have been about since not even the Bernie era, but like, you know, I remember, you know, it was always Ezra Klein and others who were kind of just like, well, you know, Medicare for all is great, but we can't really get it passed, and there's all these, you know, problems with you know, the filibuster, and you know, blah blah blah. So Yeah, so I would prefer, but what we try to do in the review is just say let's focus on the book, right? And the book, I think, has valuable insights that the left in particular needs to hear about the blockages that are blocking the revival of state capacity. And I think that's because not just liberalism, but the left as a whole has become much, since the 1970s, has become much more ensconced in this kind of Jeffersonian kind of small is beautiful vision that doesn't sort of remember that there is this other kind of big public sector state capacity vision of the left actually doing these big things. And so I think I've sort of lost my train of thought there, but I think I wanted to talk about the air quality question, which they have an unfortunate example in the book where they say that are these environmental rules worth just leading to the housing not being built, and then you have homeless encampments under a highway. And it's really, as I think Vahisen put in his reviews, not really a fair exchange. You have to choose homeless encampments or air quality, right? Mm-hmm. And I think you're right. But I think what Klein and Thompson might say is that still, with this sort of bureaucratic thicket of very strict environmental rules, it's not that it's bad because of it's we should just have bad air quality. What all these rules allow is for again, usually environmental groups to sue the government or to sue building projects and interrupt them and block them from delivering the housing. And that just creates this sort of court battle where they're, trying to see who's abiding by these thicket of rules and regulations. And actually it would be more effective and for there to just be much clearer environmental rules that were administered by an effective central EPA bureaucracy that just said you have to do X, that's it, right? And again, that's kind of how Klein and Thompson say that in the early environmental era of the 1970s, we just developed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act that actually did clean up the environment in significant and successful ways, and that's great. And they did it by just pretty much straightforward, strict regulations across the board that all power plants and all factories had to, reduce their pollution by this amount to get it down to a standard of healthy pollution, right? And so I think, again, that Hamiltonian impulse that we actually need competent central administrative power to kind of clean up the environment, right? But also not just create this kind of legalistic network where all these groups can come in and kind of block things again and again, often with good intentions of saving the environment. But ultimately, if that means we're just never going to be able to build high-speed rail or housing or clean energy, that means, in a broader sense, it means we're not going to address the climate crisis. We're not going to address the housing crisis. We're just not going to be able to do this stuff. So I agree with you, though. Obviously, we should, as particularly either if we're liberals or leftists, we should say, yeah, we can definitely have air quality and abundant housing at the same time. But the other thing, go ahead. Yeah. Well, the other thing is that if you want that abundance, and the thing Klein and Thompson don't pay much attention to is there's going to have to be a class struggle there, right? Because there are very powerful landlords and developers whose interests are in maintaining scarcity of housing and keeping rents high, right? So you actually have to have a theory of power to kind of confront that class who doesn't want abundant housing, right? Because it's against their interests.
Right. And I want to get to that. But so what I'm hearing is that maybe a more Hamiltonian kind of way to regulate sort of environmental protections and stuff would be that maybe we don't rely so much on an individual or a corporate right to sue to enforce these laws. Maybe it needs to just be up to the EPA or some other some other regulatory body within the federal government, that will just that authority needs to be beefed up. It needs to be much stronger than it is right now. But if you do that, then maybe there's a little bit more clarity, and the thicket that is that's kind of difficult to see through and difficult to identify the path actually becomes clearer. Maybe you and the end result maybe doesn't even result in any fewer regulations, but it's just like they're clearer and the path forward is made more obvious because you have one central agency responsible for the enforcement of that. But I could see a Jeffersonian person responding to that. Well, look at the Trump administration, right? Look at the Trump administration. The EPA can't save us because even if there's a Democrat in power, maybe next time there's a Trump administration in power. And so we need to be able to have somebody like a Ralph Nader have the ability to sue and take it before the courts. And because the law, the environmental activists would say, the law is clear and they're in violation of it and the EPA is not stopping it. And so now the private citizen needs to be able to have some sort of right of response or something, right? And so how do you respond to that?
Well, ultimately, I think the book is trying to, even though the book clearly was written before, in the most part was written before Trump was elected once again, I think the book is clearly trying to intervene. And they say this in the conclusion that I can't remember if I know Klein in subsequent writings has literally quoted Antonio Gramsci, the sort of idea that we're in an interregnum, the old is dying, the new cannot be born. I mean, the fact that neoliberalism has gone into crisis, really, you could argue since 2008, and Trumpism and the kind of populist right wing, which, as you're saying, is just like this, like taking a chainsaw, just ripping through the administrative state and destroying government. This Trumpism is one contending political movement to kind of realign American politics toward this populist right. But that the left or liberals or the Democratic Party needs to be able to construct a non-neoliberal alternative that can actually prevent this Trumpism and populist right from obtaining power again. And like I said, there's this kind of way of approaching American political history that we only have every few decades, these moments of kind of political realignment. It was the New Deal of the 1930s, the Reagan neoliberal revolution of the 1980s, and now we're in this other period. And I think we've been saying for a better part of a decade now that it's kind of either the Trumpist right or this kind of perhaps social democratic kind of populist left agenda that could contend for this kind of realignment. And I think, again, Klein and Thompson aren't seeing themselves as part of that kind of social democratic left per se, but they are saying that if you're a liberal, if you want the Democratic Party to become powerful again, then you might want to consider this kind of approach that again recognizes that there are problems that aren't just about Donald Trump, that are actually internal to our coalition. And the fact is that if we can't get housing right and energy right and mass transit right, and if the cities in which we govern are dysfunctional and unaffordable to masses of working people, then why would the working class and the masses of people not vote for the right and Donald Trump? But ultimately, I think it goes to Ezra Klein's kind of previous book and work on the fact that we're kind of stuck in this political polarization where the partisan polarization is so sort of razor thin, where each party is like 50-50. And we're kind of stuck in this kind of seesaw doom loop where we're kind of like going back and forth between Trump and a very lukewarm and not big state capacity Democratic Party. And I think if we continue to do that, we're just going to continue like down the drain into further and further kind of horrible right-wing reactionary things. And I think they're trying to say like, no, we need a new model. And it's got to kind of be about this sort of, again, this government that can actually deliver and build stuff for people.
Gotcha. And so I guess, what do you think what is the final verdict, you think? And I guess my question, I have a question about if my conversation with the conservative radio guy really did kind of, it shocked me because he literally knew nothing about it. And so, when I'm reading the article, I'm sensing a sort of like that you genuinely feel like there's value in some of the ideas that Klein puts forward. And I'm sensing that you also feel that there's a value in this word, like that maybe you feel like there is enough of a movement around this word or enough interest in abundance that it is worth the left contending for, rather than discarding and saying, whatever, the abundance guys are kind of like, they have some good ideas, they have some bad, but like we have a separate thing. I'm sensing that you sense a value in kind of appealing to some of the people who are interested in Klein, and saying that like if you really do want abundance, and I really do as a person, this is you speaking as a person on the socialist left, I want abundance, I think there are good ideas, you should be a socialist, you should be pro public power. That when he just had no idea about it, I was like, I was kind of wondering like, oh, maybe there's like not any value in the word abundance, or in kind of the people that are interested in this, the Klein's book. Maybe there's just not a value there, and we should just abandon, and we should just not pick up the word, because I can't really say abandon because it's not been around for longer than 6 months. But how do you respond to that? Am I picking up correctly that you sense not only are there some good ideas here, which I think very few people would disagree with. I think even in some of the antitrust critiques of it, they're like, oh yeah, there's some good ideas, but here's why the project generally is bad. But am I correct that you think there's value in trying to say that, yes, abundance is good, Klein, you should be on our side, be recruiting him and these people to kind of our politics? Am I sensing that correctly? And what should people do with this whole thing?
I wouldn't say, I think Klein is very comfortable in the New York Times and kind of more the sort of center of the Democratic Party, and that's fine. I don't think we're trying to recruit him, but I think I was like you, when it first came out, I was like very confused, because very quickly, when the book came out in March, and very quickly there was like a left-wing hostility to the book and to the ideas. And to me, it was just sort of confusing at first, but even before I read the book, because as a socialist, to me, the word abundance is like central to socialist politics, and has always been central. And to me, the at the core of the socialist project is this idea that capitalism really has created the capacity, productive capacity for mass abundance. But yet the problem is we maintain this kind of these social relations of production that actually, again, maintain scarcity and create all this sort of unnecessary poverty. But actually, it's capitalism that has developed the productive forces in a way that, as Engels actually put it, for the first time in human history, we actually have the productive capacity to deliver abundance for everyone, for all of humanity, right? And we can abolish poverty for the first time in human history, right? And that is really the promise of socialism, to deliver kind of the basic material needs to everyone on Earth. And as we point out in the review, that is still not the case. We still have close to 1 billion people that don't have electricity on the planet, that don't have access to potable water and sanitation. It's a complete scandal of capitalism that there's so much poverty and scarcity in this ridiculously abundant world. So to me, as a socialist, like, this is our word, abundance. So to me, like one of my initial reactions, like, why is everyone so hostile to abundance? We're the ones that's supposed to be arguing for abundance. In fact, I don't want to, Jacobin, they make their own titles and they're great titles, but our original title for this piece is called "Since When Did the Left Oppose Abundance?" Right? Because that is to me like a big part of the socialist project. But again, we're not trying to recruit Klein and Thompson per se, but we are trying to point out that, as I said before, that if you really want abundance of housing, abundance of energy, abundance of public goods, you really have to take on the capitalist class. You have to take on the class interest and the capitalist system that wants to maintain artificial scarcity of those goods to maintain prices and profits for particular sectors of capital. And so, again, when you look back into history, which honestly, like, I wish the abundance book talked more about the New Deal. And this was not only a period where the public sector and FDR and the New Deal delivered a kind of public version of abundance, but they did so in a way that actually confronted the rich and powerful. And, there's this great speech that FDR gave in 1936 campaign where he said the financial elite are unanimous in their hatred for me, and I welcome their hatred. And he raised taxes on the rich in a significant way to fund his kind of abundance agenda of state capacity. And so that kind of, again, that Bernie Sanders kind of ethos of like, to actually deliver for the working class, we have to take on the rich and powerful who are kind of rigging our economy for their own benefit. I think I share that concern with the book with the antitrust and anti-monopoly folks. And to be honest, like the New Deal really combined the kind of anti-monopoly and kind of Hamiltonian vision really well. And I think just yesterday, Mamdani, Zoran in New York City, the hopefully person who's going to be the next mayor of New York City, who claimed he wanted to deliver an abundance for the 99%. He kind of did appropriate this language of abundance. He also was just touting the work of Lena Khan, who's like the FTC head under Biden, who's an icon of the anti-monopoly left. So he is trying to, combine the kind of the best of the anti-monopoly and the Hamiltonian left into kind of this full-scale vision of leftist abundance. And I think that's really the direction we need to go.
Matt Huber is a professor of geography at Syracuse University, author of Climate Change as Class War, and author of the recent piece Abundance for the 99% in Jacobin Magazine with Lee Smith and Fred Stafford. Matt, thank you for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project. And you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.